Hi, my name is Amar, and in this short presentation, I'll be showing you how to use an external API manager to call information from the Infor Data Lake. So the steps that we will take is to create an authorized API in our Cloud Suite tenant, identify which Data Lake APIs need to be called for the use case or cases as it may be, set up a third-party API manager. We will be using Postman, using information from the first two steps. We will end up with a SQL dataset. Use of that data is outside the scope of this demo. So the first thing we need to do is set up that authorized API, and this will provide tenant and access or credential information needed to set up your API manager. So we go into Iron API, we go into authorized apps. Let's add an app, give it a name. I've called it MR Postman. It has to be of type web. Let's give it a description. You need to put a redirect URL, and this is dependent on that tool that you are using. So this is the one for Postman. We also add it here. So this will now create the information that we need. So let's save this. And now we can download the credentials, and this will give us all the information for our OAuth 2 credential. So this is an Iron API file. And you see we have this now in our list. The next step we need to do then is let's view the Data Lake APIs so we can see how to make the calls. So we're going to Data Fabric, you're going to Compass V2, and you see a list of APIs. And actually, it's not a single call, it's multiple calls that have to be made. The first one is a post. So basically what we're doing here is submitting a SQL job. This will then return a query ID that we have to use in the next step. That next step is a get statement looking at the status of that job. Whether it's running, whether it's finished and cancelled and so forth. Once it's finished, again, we will get a query ID and we will use that in the next step, which is to actually get the result of that job. So the presentation itself is not on how to set up and use an API tool per se. It is to show how a third-party tool can access the data lake. And for this example, as I said earlier, we'll be using Postman. Okay, it does assume knowledge. So we're assuming that the user knows how to use the API tool, understands our data lake schemas, so the schemas of the objects that they will be calling, how to use SQL statements to get that information. We'll be doing the steps manually here, but again, we're assuming the user knows how to use their tool and automate the steps that we'll be doing. Once the data is returned, we're not really going to be covering on the use of that data. This is just to prove that we can get that data. So when we generated the Iron API file, this is what we got. The top half is a single line with all the information. But if you break it down into value pairs so it's easier to read, you see we have an identifier and a value. And these will be used to set up your tool. So within Postman, or whichever manager you're using, you have to configure OAuth 2 authorization. In the case of Postman, we'll be setting a token name. We need to enter details from the Iron API file. Okay, so using the value pairs, for example, in the authorized URL, it's the PU pair plus the OA. Token is the PU plus the OT, and so on. And what does that really mean? So if we look at the Postman setups, you see everything's already set up here. This is how the data maps across. So there's the Postman URL, the redirect URL we put in, which is already here, cannot be changed in the case of Postman. You have things like the client secret key, so that's the CS key here, or value pair. Client ID from the CI value pair. The authorization URL is a combination of the PU pair plus OA for the authorization. Access token, a combination of the PU plus the OT. So that's how the data maps across. So the process that we're going to go through is get an access token, which will be used in each of the steps below. We are then going to make the post call, as I said earlier, and this is the URL we will use, where the X's are replaced by the tenant name, which is a TI value or value pair from the Iron API file. As I said earlier, that will return a query ID for the job. We then make a get call, with replace the tenant name here, and the Y's is the query ID from the previous step. We then make another get call to get the result of the job, and again, X's is your tenant ID, and the Z's are the query ID from the previous step. So let's actually go into a demo and see how all this works. So here I am in Postman, and I've already set up the steps here. So we've got data lake, get job, get status, and get the result. So on the first step, get data lake, you see we've set up an OAuth 2 with the various fields already. We're going to be getting a token, so we can get an access token. Here we are, and you see it's given a name, DL token, which we'll use later on. Let's put the token in. We have that information there. So the first step is to get job. There's my URL at the top. The authorization we have to set, so we tell it to use the token we got from the previous step. The body is the SQL statement that we'll be calling. So in this instance, I'm getting item information from the mitmas table. So we're talking to M3 in this case. We do send, and that then comes back with a query ID. So we copy that query ID because we need that in the next step, which is the job status. And again, you see the parameters that we can use. Authorization, again, tell it to use the same token from the first step, and we're going to replace the Y's there with the token from the previous step, or the query ID rather. We do send. You see the job has now finished. Okay, it brings back the query ID and the columns. You'll also see that there's almost 11,000 records that it's returned. So we go into the job result step. And again, what we do is replace the Z's there with the query ID from the previous step. There's other parameters here. I've limited to 100 records, as you can see. Again, authorization, tell you to use the same token. We do send, and you see our result set. Okay, company number, status, item, description, and so forth. The 100 odd records. So this has now brought the records back, and from this point onwards, we can use that information in whichever system that you want. So what have we shown? We've created an authorized API, downloaded the files with the tenant and credential details. We viewed the Iron API Swagger documentation for the data fabric, so now we know what the URL was, and the input and app parameters. And we've used a third-party tool to get information from the data lake. We retrieved the SQL dataset, and that can be put into a local repository or any other system has needed. Thank you.